same to my mind. And that's the morphology view. So every time morphologists encounter inflectional paradigms, so this is the Czech conjugation, you can do, you can immediately see a degree of similarity between various forms of the verb, depending on the person number combinations. And that similarity is usually attributed to the notion of a root. So inflectional paradigms are usually considered to contain an element that people call a root. And as, for example, Arnold defines it, that the root is whatever is left when all morphological structure, and I actually don't know why he says morphological structure, it can be just the morpheme, it can be morphological pieces. When all morphological structure has been removed or wrung out of a form. Okay, so how does that work? So when you sort of look at any inflectional paradigm, what you see there is that there is a shared component among all the forms. And what I just did now was I removed the person endings to arrive, to follow sort of Arnold's suggestion to start removing all this kind of a morphological structure that's sitting on top of a common base. So these are the person markers. And of course, if one expands on that paradigm, for example, including also the past tense form and the infinitival form, you'll see that even after I have removed the person number endings, there is still some differences here. So here I have the short vowel and here I have a long vowel. And so if I sort of try to separate away or wrung out the morphemes further and further, what I'm going to end up with is a segmentation that you see here, where you have the root pros, and in case you don't speak Czech, that means to ask for something. Okay. Now this segmentation is of course confirmed also by the imperative forms of the verb to ask for. Okay, so the singular imperative, you go ask for something, corresponds just to the root, and here we have the second plural marker. So there is this kind of a shared piece of phonology common to all the forms, and that corresponds to the morphological. And I mean, you didn't really have to come here for me to tell you that. Now, the important consequence of this very simple view is that you can also recognize roots in the same morphological sense, for example, in the declension of the demonstratives. Okay, so here you have a demonstrative, this, and that has various forms depending on the gender of the noun it modifies and depending on the case of the noun it modifies. Okay, and the thing is that just like in the verbal paradigm, we can see a shared component, namely the T, which is in the morphological sense, that's the root of the demonstrative. Okay? And I mean, this is not really controversial for anyone doing morphology, but it's kind of important to keep that in mind for the sake of what's coming. Okay? Now, again, the fact that this T here is to be considered the root and the other forms inflectional affixes is sort of at least partly confirmed by the WH pronoun, which is koho, okom, komu. And I've shown you those forms of the WH pronoun in Czech, meaning who. Those forms which kind of share these masculine endings, so just switching the demonstrative root this for the WH root which. Okay? Now, this would be all pretty simple and not very remarkable if it was not for the syntactician's view on roots. So let me try to tell you something about that. Okay? So in syntax, for a very long time, instead of the distinction between the roots and affixes, we have had the distinction between lexical categories and functional categories. And I'm very happy that Joe Emonds is going to be talking, is it next time, Joe, or after that? Next time. Because he has worked a lot on this distinction, and you're going to learn a lot about this, I hope, from his talk next time. Okay? And so what is this distinction? I'm going to be very, very brief, because really, I think there's people who have worked on this much more than I have. Okay? And I'm just going to illustrate that by means of an example. So if you go back to Chomsky's, say, 1957 work called Syntactic Structures, a book that made him famous, he suggested that whenever you have a noun phrase, okay, that noun phrase somehow decomposes into two components, which he called the T and N. Okay? And then he sort of added additional rules to kind of make clear what it is that he actually means, where T was uniformly rewritten as the, whereas the N could be rewritten in very many different ways. He gives examples of man, ball, and then there's kind of three dots. Okay? Now, this kind of a rewrite algorithm is pretty much equivalent to the tree structure format that you've seen before. Okay? So the idea is that the noun phrase consists of a noun and the element T, which later became known as the determiner, and people started calling it D. Okay? But Chomsky called it T in 1957. Now, the immediate difference that you see between the lexical and functional categories has to do with the three dots that you see here. Okay? It's no accident that there's three dots, because there's very many nouns. And so people say, well, there is an open category, and you can pretty much keep adding to that category. Okay? Now, the task to write here all the elements belonging to the T category, to the determiner category, is easy, even if you consider, say, the indefinite article, which Chomsky for some reason ignored in his description. But so even if you like went the and then maybe some, it would sort of be done pretty quickly. Okay? So there is a big difference between lexical and functional categories. The lexical ones kind of express sort of content, the functional ones serve the grammar. Okay, you take a set and you pick an individual out of that set or something like that. I really wonder why the slides don't work. Yeah, so that's just what I told you. Now, sort of going on from 1957, there were, of course, some changes that happened. And one of the kind of major changes that happened in syntax was that people sort of reconsidered as to what should be considered the head of the phrase. So whereas before, in 1957, Chomsky kind of following the tradition of the back then structuralist linguistics, was talking about noun phrases and noun phrases containing determiners. He actually later, in later work, the field switched to considering the determiner the head of the whole phrase rather than the noun. Okay? And the reason was, well, that's because, you know, the determiner is minimally as important to the whole noun phrase as the noun. So, I mean, you just in English can't say book arrived or something like that. No, the determiner is very important there. And it also determines very much the external syntactic distribution. So people kind of switch to making the functional elements the head of the whole phrase. Okay. Now, that's going to be lead to interesting consequences when one starts looking at other languages. So this is Danish, where in 6a I give you the form of a book. Okay? And book. And I hope it's pronounced book. Okay. So I'm going to read it in the Norwegian way. It couldn't have been Norwegian for reasons that Jeff of course knows about. So in 6b you see the definite form of the noun book. And what you see here is that unlike in English, where the determiner is a separate word, or at least it's written separately, here the definiteness marker is a suffix on the noun. So you say something that would come out as book in Norwegian and comes out probably differently in Danish. Okay, and that means the book. But at the same time, you don't want to say that nouns in the Danish lexicon simply are inflected for definiteness. Okay, and the reason why people don't want to say that is because when you add an adjective into the mixture, okay, what you have to say is den gamle bok. Okay? And what's important here is that the definiteness marking disappears from the noun, unlike in many other Scandinavian varieties. Danish has no so-called double definiteness. Okay. And so the idea from the very beginning was, well, there is a single definite article and it's kind of added syntactically, and its distribution simply somehow follows the rules of syntax. And so the idea about the structures, I'm simplifying here very much. There's a lot of literature on this by Dílna Ke and colleagues. That the definite marker is always a separate element in the syntactic representation. Okay, so you see it here you have the book, and here you have the suffix or definite article. Even though it's a suffix, okay, people still think it's a separate head in the syntactic representation, because as soon as you put an adjective phrase between the determiner and the noun, then all of a sudden, the linearization is different and the form is slightly different, and there's all sorts of proposals on the table of how you want to relate these two structures, but crucially these are syntactic proposals. Okay? They are proposals about how the realization of the definite article varies depending on whether it combines just with the noun or with a phrase that contains the noun and an adjective. Okay? But the conclusion that people drew from that is that there is something here, that's shared. So I told you that the noun, that was the lexical category, that was the kind of a rich encyclopedic content thing, the open class. And what you see is that in both of these structures, the book comes out as a root. Okay? So there was the observation that lexical categories in general correspond to what people call morphological roots. Okay? On the other hand, the functional markers, okay, then they can correspond to affixes. Okay? So there is here, if you look at A, and if you will be looking only at A, it sort of looks like the lexical category is the root and the functional category is an affix. Okay, so there is something that the distinction between roots and affixes has in common between the distinction between lexical categories and functional categories. Can you guys see relatively well? Because I can also set up another thing here, which I was intending to.
It's okay.
That's how do I use Parrott projector? Yes. Yeah. So there is an affinity between being a lexical category and being a root. Okay? When you're a functional category, you can be an affix, but you can also, as you see here in 7, you can also have two parts, namely the D part, which morphologists normally would consider a root, and an N affix. Okay? So you can be a self-standing word with a root and an affix even when you're a functional element. Okay? Now, this relatively clear picture sort of started blaring up. So here's some blaring up. Okay, and the slide, the section is called how lexical category became empty. Okay, and so this is again a story about lexical categories and what happens to them when people are thinking about grammar. So if you look at, say, plural marking, so in English you have the phrase the books, okay, and you see that there is an S element there, the book is the root, the S is an affix, okay. Now already in Chomsky's 1957, there was kind of a very interesting rule set for dealing with singular and plural noun phrases. So what Chomsky basically said is that there was a rule where you took the empty as an input and you could change it in one of two conceivable ways. You can either turn it into a singular noun phrase or you can turn it into a plural noun phrase. And then depending on which of the two steps you took, that later led to two different rules applying to the singular and plural noun phrases, such that if it was a singular noun phrase, you kind of rewrote that noun phrase as composing of the determiner, the noun, and a zero. Okay? If it was plural, then you transcribed it as the noun, and an S. The thing which is interesting about this is that from very early on, Chomsky kind of had this symmetry of treating roots and affixes in the same kinds of rule schemas. Okay? There was no boundary between morphology and syntax. Okay? When you look at the tree structure representation, it just simply says that the noun phrase contains three elements, and there's no notation of the asymmetry that the book, except for being the head, should be somehow, inflected for plural or anything. The S for all that matter to the system could very easily be just a separate verb. Okay? The fact that it turned up as an affix was more of a phonological effect rather than effect of how the rule schema operated. Okay? Now, the reason why I'm sort of starting with this when I'm talking about the emptying of the root. Okay, so people usually, when you go to school and you talk about nouns, so yes, they tell you they denote things and animals and events conceived of as things and so on and so forth. But they also tell you that they inflect for all sorts of categories like number, gender, case, and so on and so forth. But here in this approach, from very early on, the plural was completely divorced from the root. It does not belong to the noun in any more substantial way than the definite article. Okay? Now, in the sort of modern version, sort of adopting already the general line which I told you, these affixes became heads and the representation in general became more layered. Okay? So now the idea was that when you have the noun book, okay, there is the lexical category that corresponds to the root, to which you add number, just like you add definiteness in Danish as an affix. Okay? But it's a syntactic affixation. And then that whole number phrase denoting the plurality of books, kind of you choose one set out of that plurality. Okay? And so that's how roots in generative theory are becoming more and more empty. So the way they're becoming empty is that the inflectional categories, okay, that people usually think belong to the noun, they're treated as separate elements in the syntax. Then if you look at Spanish, now I am not Spanish, I had Spanish at high school, and this is what I remember, and I hope it's right. That when you have the girls, then there is this root in the morphological sense, okay, muchach. And then if it's a female gender or feminine gender, then you put the a. Whereas if it's a boy, then you put an o. Okay, so muchacha is a girl, muchacho is a boy, as far as I remember from my textbook. Okay. Now, if it's a plurality of girls, then you put an S, and if it's a plurality of boys, then you put an S as well. Okay. So, following the very same reasoning, just over and over again, you're taking away again one of the properties of what people usually associate with the nominal root, namely gender, and you say, well, that's really a separate syntactic category. We have the root denoting, say, a child, and if that child belongs to the feminine gender, then you put an A, and if that's a plurality, then in addition you put an S. Okay? But that's the story how the noun becomes more and more empty of grammatical properties. Okay? Now, this is a case I know slightly more about.
Can you go to the preceding one? In the last you have the A and S as well. What would you say about the A and S?
If you want a quick and dirty answer, I would say that it's an ellipsis remnant. Okay, so let me make use of this fancy technology. So, in general has to do about concord. So we know that there are languages that you put an adjective and a noun together, and then you have no concord. Okay, like in English, you put an S here. Okay, and then even in such languages where you have no concord, you have a way of generating adjectives with inflection. And the way you do it is you do noun phrase ellipsis. So when you elide the noun, okay, you end up with a sequence of an adjective followed by the S. Okay, so everybody's grammar, even without saying anything about concord, has a way of generating sequences of objects that are not nouns, okay, followed by plural morphology. Okay, and that's actually the story of, say, I don't know, third person pronouns. Okay, and in Czech you have the demonstrative pronouns, for example, right, where you can simply do an ellipsis of the noun, okay, and you end up with a form like 10, and it sort of serves as a pronoun. Okay?
I'm happy that you used the demonstrative. Could you say what agrees with what? How do you know that it's las which agrees with muchachas and not muchachas that agree with las?
Yes, so I am all building up to the way that basically what you have to do is you have to have the adjective as a relative clause added to the noun. Okay, so this is an internally added relative clause. Inside that relative clause you have whatever morphology you have on the noun. In the case of Spanish it's as. Okay, so there is muchachas, and here you have that very thing again. Okay, so there are languages that actually have relative clause structures of exactly this source. Okay, which is something like the horse that I bought, the horse. Okay. In English, the horse that I bought, with an ellipsis of the noun. Okay, so you elide here the noun, and that thing ends up here. And the reason why it's us, both cases, has to do with the identity condition on the ellipsis. I mean, it's a very arcane story, and I would need a lot of time to make that fly. So there's another case, one I know something more about. Okay? So I happen to be working for a while on Luganda, which is a southern Bantu language spoken in Uganda. And the very same kind of way of organizing the roots and the affixes shows up in this language. So let me tell you something about it. So you probably know that languages in the southern part of Africa reaching slightly to West Africa, Southwest Africa. They're called Bantu languages. Okay? So if you look here, there's something you should remember if nothing else sticks. Okay, so Abantu in Luganda means people. Okay, so Bantu languages are actually like human languages. Now, the noun for people, which is a plural, contrasts with the singular omuntu, which is one person. Okay, and you see that there is a shared part, which I sort of separated by a dash, which is preceding by omu for singular and aba for plural. Now the interesting thing is that exactly the same root, tu, also shows up in the verb for thing, which is echintu, and things, which is ebintu. Okay? So the way people describe that in the grammars is that there is this kind of a root that means something like the being or existence, okay? And that a root can be classified to various genders. Either it's an animate being and then it refers to one or more people, okay? Or it's an inanimate being and then it refers to a thing, okay? There's also the noun for a place, awantu, where awa is a kind of a locative type prefix and it occurs with nouns such as like front, back, parts of object, and so it classifies the being as a kind of a spatially restricted being at a certain place. Okay? And the class prefixes seem to encode pretty much similar notions as the Spanish as or os. Okay? Now, these prefixes should be separated into at least two parts. So this is a pair of sentences where the verb is in both cases almost the same. So this is I didn't break, this is I didn't break. And then you have a class 7 inanimate singular kopo, obviously related to the English cup. So if you say saya si zači kopo, that means I didn't break any cup. Okay? When you say sačia si za eči kopo, then you say I didn't break the cup. Okay? And so the two sentences, among others, differ in whether the class marker here has the form chi or echi. Okay? And the intuition that many people have followed is that the presence of the so-called initial vowel corresponds to the difference in the interpretation, such that here you have the interpretation any cup, so it's an indefinite, non-specific. Whereas here there is a particular cup we are talking about, and I want to say that I didn't break that cup. Okay? And so the idea was that this initial vowel, as it were, corresponds to an analog of the English definite article or the Spanish L. Okay? So this is just sort of shown graphically here, where you can basically separate all the prefixes into two bits. The first one corresponding to the gender number prefix. Okay? It's animate singular, animate plural, inanimate singular, inanimate plural, localized. And the very first bit, which tends to be missing in indefinite context, so you also wouldn't see it, for example, if you would use that noun as a predicate. So if you would want to say, this is a big cup, you would say chikopo chinene. Okay, it's a Prodrop language, so this is, you leave away, and you just use the noun chikopo chinene without the initial vowel, and then it serves as a predicate. You say this is a big cup. Whereas if you want to say the cup is big, then you say echikopo chinene. So you would include the initial vowel into the echikopo part, and that would mean it's not a predicate, it's a referential thing. Okay? So there's the general picture you can sort of draw by looking at Bantu from the perspective of the structures we've been looking at, that you have the initial vowel, okay, sitting somewhere high up in D, and then you have the number and gender complex realized by a so-called portmanteau marker. Okay, so a portmanteau marker is a morphe that expresses more than a single category. But it sort of looks like the hypothesis that there is something like a definiteness, number and gender sitting somewhere outside of the nominal root, which really is not kind of inherently specified for any of this. That seems to be kind of traceable to various languages, including the Bantu ones. Okay?
Can I ask you a question before
Please do.
Go on? So Hutu should mean something like a being,
Yeah.
and then the
Existence.
genders are going to contribute some other semantic bit like animate or inanimate or location. So I just wondered where animals fit into this picture. So do they? So in other words, what is the noun for animal? And is it related to this root or whatever into? I just wonder if this means being, and then I combine it with some gender to get person versus thing.
Yeah, so you are quite right in that I do think it is true that this class, even though I call it animate, is dedicated to humans. So I should be more speaking more about the humanness rather than animacy. And I think you are perfectly right about that. Now, I can't remember what happens to animals. I only know that the verb for a butterfly is in class 7. The verb for a fly is in class 9. So these are treated as inanimate on this count. So, but I don't know whether that applies to insects and what do higher animals do. But
Yeah. Gender.
I should figure it out. But I don't think that there is any class specifically dedicated to animals. Yes.
Well, because I'm just thinking in terms of sort of semantic decomposition, right? Like, I mean, so if that's the game that we play, then I just wonder, like, how do you semantically decompose the difference between human, animal, and thing?
So there is a kind of a research that's, and it's really centuries of research, and it's not very simple. And so usually, for those of you who know, so the noun classes in Bantu come in pairs. So you have class 1 and class 2, and that's a pair because the odd classes refer to singulars and the even classes refer to plurals. Okay? And usually when you see the system introduced, you say, well, class 1, the things that belong to class 1, like person, form plural in class 2. Now that sort of covers some of the things, but there's also class 1 nouns, like Umuganda would be a person living in Uganda. And I do strongly believe that the plural is in class 6, so you get Amaganda, okay? And class 6 is not shown here. But in class 6, you also find mess nouns like water, and so on and so forth. And it was even funny, like when people try to coordinate two nouns in class 6, like the people of Uganda and people of Rwanda, or whatever you had, they actually trigger a class 2 agreement on the verb. So there's like a lot of unclear things going on. And, so I agree with you that this is more like suggesting a general direction, sort of factoring out certain semantic primitives out of the root because the root seems to be oblivious to them. But there's the big job to be done as to how to sort out the details. And that's, I think, still a far shot.
Thanks.
Yeah, well, thanks to I forgot almost everything. in those couple of years I haven't been looking at it. Okay, and so this is just kind of putting here a quote from Hagit Borer's work. So Hagit Borer is one of the kind of visionaries in the field that people cite a lot and they read a lot. And so this is just a quote sort of her following the very same general trend that I just showed you and trying to make some sense out of it. And so she concludes that so far the investigation of expressions like the table or walk the dog proceeded from the assumption that formal properties of such expressions can be fully accommodated without availing ourselves at any point of information that is uniquely connected to, and now she gives the lexical, the lexical categories, table, walk, and dog respectively. Rather, both syntax and the crucial aspects of the semantics can be computed on the basis of functors, by which she means the functional categories, and the semantic formulas which such functors denote. Okay, so she's saying in order to explain your syntax and semantics, just can ignore the lexical categories and you only look at the functional categories. That's what she's basically saying. And I think that there's a lot of people in generative grammar who sort of entertain that position, and it sort of shows a general shift of attention from the lexical categories to really trying to understand the grammatical part of grammar. Okay, so let us not talk about the difference between cats and dogs and puppies and so on. Let us focus on the animate, human, singular, plural, definite, and so on. Okay, these are much more indicative of how the grammar works, rather than the lexical items like walk, dog, and table. And that's really just a quote. Okay, and that quote leads to the emergence of a new notion in generative grammar in recent time, and that's a notion of an S-root. Okay, and I'm calling it S-root for syntax root, okay, just to make sure that this is a completely different notion from the notion of root that people use in morphology. Okay, it's a completely different notion, and I think it's extremely misleading that people started calling that roots. Okay, but I'm going to show you how that happened. And I think that when this conference is really called At the Roots, what people mean is the S root, but we will have to ask them too. Okay, and so imagine now we are all living in this world where all the semantic contribution of the roots is getting washed away, and the only difference you're left with is does meow or does wop wop or something like that. Okay, and worse it gets. Okay, so apart from this general tendency to sort of strip the roots of the content, there was the observation that really what's left as the lexical items actually do not correspond to nouns or verbs. They are actually ambiguous. So a thing like dance in English, so you can dance with someone, or you can observe a dance. Okay? It's the same thing. I mean, how can you say that we factor away all these kinds of genders and event structure, and what we are left with are supposed to be nouns and verbs, but are they really nouns and verbs? Okay, and there's also the less obvious ambiguity. So even the roots like dog are ambiguous between a noun and a verb. And the observation was that at least for English this is fairly typical. So there's lots of items that behave like this, and there's rather few items that are kind of well behaved. Okay, so we were playing this game of removing lots of semantic contribution away of the noun, and what we are supposed to be left with is a noun, but hey, where is that noun? What we are left with is rather something which is much more underspecified. It's neither a noun nor a verb. So really, what is it? And so here comes the birth of the root. in syntax, okay? So this is a quote from Emig and Neuer's 1999 paper on distributed morphology, and it's an overview paper, it's not original research, okay? So already at 1999, there's this quote saying different parts of speech can be defined as a single L morpheme. And see, this is what happened to the lexical morphemes. They first got demoted to L morphemes. We don't even call them lexical. Okay, and now it comes overruled. Okay, I just don't understand this step here. Okay.
They must have been thinking of Moran's, right? I mean, he was talking about roots in 96, 97.
Yeah, so I should probably read it or reread that thing. Yeah. But anyway, so but they are giving credit to Pesetsky's work. And I mean, if what they mean is zero syntax, right? I mean, I know completely. I mean, zero syntax is now remembered for the cascades versus this kind of bracketing paradoxes types of structures. I mean, there's nobody citing Pesetsky for the notion of root these days.
Yeah.
But anyway, they say, so different parts of speech can be defined as a single lexical morpheme or root, to adopt the terminology of Pesetsky, in certain local relations with category-defining functional morphemes. For example, a noun or a nominalization is a root whose nearest C-commanding functional morpheme is a determiner. Okay? So the way people interpret it is that there is this kind of a thing that people started denoting by the square root. Okay, this symbol in English, you know, odmocnina for Czechs, is called the square root. And so people use this root part, you know, as a kind of a mnemonic to designate roots. And they, for the first time, appeared in syntactic trees, you know, without any category, saying there is just this root dog, it's neither a noun nor a verb, so let's call it a root, and let's say that, you know, what we used to call a noun is this root in a local combination with a determiner. Okay? And when you take the very same root and you put a tense to it, something like, you know, they dogged me, then it becomes a verb. Okay? And that's how roots were born. It's a completely new object. So Borer, in her recent book, which I actually don't know which year it appeared, but it's the third volume of her enormous trilogy, Structuring Sense, where she says that by virtue of being syntactic objects without a category, roots represent a novel syntactic term. So there is a novel thing that appeared in the syntax which people call the root, and they are different by having no category. There are some people who take it even further and say that roots have no syntactic properties, but that's not Borer's case. Okay. Borer does not claim that. But there are people who say that roots have no syntactic categories, yet they appear in syntax, and to me that starts resembling the virgin conception. Now, but at the same time, okay, I think that there is a certain parallel between why people sort of use the term root, okay? Because remember, the morphological roots were kind of a leftover. It was whatever is left when all morphological structure has been removed to the form, and the syntactic root is whatever is left, and we know very little about what's left. Okay, it's neither a noun nor a verb. When all functional categories are removed from a form. Okay, so syntactic research has been, you know, undergoing this stage when people realized, and you can look really at anything, you can look at nouns, you can look at verbs, where people realize there's very little that's actually stored in the root, and lots of the meaning which we associate with the root is associated with functional categories. Okay, but here comes the thing. So, you know, whenever you hear people talk about roots these days, they talk about roots in the sense in which book here is a root, but then is not a root, and it neither contains one. Okay? So just be careful about it. Okay? This is a completely different root from notion of a root from the one people use in morphology. It's completely different. Has nothing in common. Okay? Because in the morphological sense, the D is a root to which En attaches, but for syntacticians, or for those syntacticians working in the framework that I alluded to, this is not a root. Okay?
Just one small question about the morphological root. Yeah, just it's not a funny question. What about the term stem and this term morphological root, whatever is left? Does stem serve that function for you? Or?
No, so I think that stem, has a place in the morphological theory that still hasn't been hijacked by syntacticians or many by mainstream syntacticians. I mean, there are some attempts to hijack the stem to syntax, but I want to stay away from it. So stem, is whatever is left when you remove inflection. So person number in the case of verbs, okay, that gives you a stem. So if I just go back at the very beginning, it's very good to sort of bring it up, So I just want to use some time on that. I was hoping. Oh, yeah. Yes, here. Yeah. So remember the first step was this one, okay? And this is simply just by removing the person number things. And this thing which is left when you remove the person number thing, that's stem. Okay, that's when you remove the productive morphology, the inflection. And then what you are left with is still bicomponential, as you can see with the comparison with the imperative and with the past thing. And so people call this a stem.
So the difference between stem and root in the morphological sense is only inflection versus other?
So, I mean, the difference really is this. So, if you look at Czech infinitives, every infinitive has st. Maybe one doesn't. Okay, moci. But basically, every infinitive has a t. Now, what you find before the t varies. It's a variable. Okay. So there is some kind of an important boundary here, such that this one is very productive, and there's 5 options that you find here, and they're usually somehow connected to the root, and they're not completely productive. For example, here for the porosit, okay, I can put maybe one other, but that's it. There are like 5 or 6, depending on definitions, but I can only have 2 of them here. So it's kind of semi-productive, okay? And so the notion of a stem is whatever the fully productive morphology connects to, okay? And you don't need to call it inflection, derivation, whatever. That's really a degree of productivity. And people usually call this inflection and they call this derivation.
It's like a theme vowel? Would that count as?
Yeah, that's the theme vowel.
Thank you.
And so stem is potentially complex, and it's a unit to which the productive morphology attaches. How do I do this in a smart way? So that was... Oh. Go ahead.
Can I go back to las muchachas? If root is what is C commanded by the functional head, then I can say that root is L as much as root is muchach. How do I choose what is root?
So in the morphological sense, L is a root.
Well, in any, under the definition that root is the thing which is C commanded by functional head, and I see the R in both, how do I know that it belongs to muchach and it doesn't belong to
No. A root is not the thing which is C commanded by functional head. Everything is C commanded by functional head. The root is...
okay, the thing which is the category is
Yes.
commanded by functional head.
Yeah, which has no category.
Well, then yeah, so then L is root with no category, which is...
No, L is D. It has a category in the lexicon, is D.
And the question is, how do you know that this os or as belongs to muchacho and not to L? One of them agrees, yeah, that you explained to me. But how do you know which of them agrees with which? I'm asking because when I ask our, let's say, uneducated students why, let's say, kniha is feminine, they say because it's ta.
Because it's?
Ta. They learned at primary school that gender of the noun is given by demonstrative, so they have the feeling that gender comes from demonstrative.
But that's completely true. I mean, it's a definitional property of gender, is that gender is an agreement clause. So there is no language with gender that doesn't have agreement. If there are languages which have these types of morphemes, as in Bantu, and they don't agree, then you call it noun class, but you don't call it gender. So there is a difference in the morphological nomenclature between a noun class, so you can, noun class is, for example, a declension is a version of a noun class. You belong to the first, second, third, fourth, or fifth declension in Latin without that affecting your agreement property. So that's a noun class. But gender is only that part of the noun class information which is relevant to concord or agreement. But that's definitional. I mean, that's really has very little to do with how the system works, I think. I think that there is like a noun class system, that you're human, animate, inanimate, mass, count, and so on and so on. And part of this distinction gets reflected through concord. And which these are, that's kind of dependent on the particular language. And I don't think there's anything deep about this. But yes, I mean, when your students do what they're doing the right thing, I think. I mean, there's no other way of testing for gender except for by concord.
Yeah, but here is the source of the thing, because you claim that it's agreement on ta, and they think it's the source. Something what you then disagree because you have the feeling that girl is feminine because it's girl. But if you don't have root there which says that it's a girl, then why do you add gender to this girl and not to the determinant?
Well, I don't know, that's an interesting question. But I don't see how I'm gonna answer it right now. So.
Could it be the functional head cluster without the root?
Take it again.
If the source were the article, then you will get the example of clustering of functional heads without the root.
Yes.
So
as far as I know, there's nothing wrong about it. I mean, the functional heads just have a meaning, and you can just put together a couple of functional heads with corresponding meaning without invoking the root.
So I thought it would be a nice example for rootless structures.
Yes. I mean, the thing is that they are rootless only in the syntactic type of sense, right? They are not rootless in the morphological type of sense, and that was really the only point I was after. Okay, so we've got 30 minutes to go. I'll need 20. Okay. Now, so far what I've done is I gave you the first part of my talk. I tried to explain, not without problems and maybe not without contradictions, what these days syntacticians mean when they talk about roots. Okay. And I just tried to build up a position that I find comprehensible. If I failed, sorry about it. Now, against that, I want to basically say that there is no need for the notion of an S root. Okay, I just want to throw it out. There are no acategorial roots or nodes in syntax. That is, that there are no novel objects in the Borer DM sense. Okay, that was a mistake. You should have never gone that way. unlike the traditional view, I'm going to say, okay, so that pretty much brings me back to the traditional view before Borer and others sort of came to the story. In addition, I will try to convince you that there are no lexical categories. Namely, it's functional categories all the way down. There is no lexical category or a root hiding at the bottom of the tree. All categories in a language are of the functional status. And the only sensible notion of a root that I see is the notion of an M-root. And both the lexical M-roots and the functional M-roots are simply the pronunciation of functional categories to which other affixes attached. Okay. There's no mystery. Now, I'm not the first one to claim that. So there's already a work by Gillian Ramchand, which is very well known in the circles that also speak about S-roots. And what Ramchand did was she tried to provide an account of various types of verbs. Okay? So when you look at verbs as a lexical category, there's various types of verbs. There's transitive verbs, there's intransitive verbs, there's theoretic verbs, there's atheoric verbs, and so on and so forth. Okay? What she basically said is that, you know, instead of saying that there's this kind of overarching category of verb, you can decompose any verbal eventuality into the maximum of three components. Namely, there's always going to be a process. Okay? So verbs basically denote processes. Okay? But process is not a lexical head. It's just like any functional head. Just like it can be definite or indefinite, it can denote a process or not. In addition, that process can be caused, so it can have an initiation, and that initiation can be either internal or external. Okay? And that depends on other things. And processes can also lead to results. Okay? And here's just a couple of examples of how she sort of classifies what used to be called the lexical categories simply as various collections of functional categories. So for her, when John enters in the room, the verb enter necessarily denotes all the three components. Okay? So John, first of all, has to do something. He's conscious about his action. There's a process that sort of leads him from outside of the room to inside the room. And as a result of that process, he is in the room. Okay, so enter, classically, because of having this result component, in English is classified as theoric verb. And what theoric verbs do is that you can modify the result by, you can say he entered the room in a very short time, or he entered the room, and it's a theoric verb. Now, on the other hand, a verb like walk is similar to enter. Okay, so there is someone doing the walking, and there is a process of walking, but it does not necessarily lead to a particular result, such as that you are somewhere. Okay, when you enter something, you end up in a state of being there. You can walk for hours and hours and hours and not ending up at any location that's noteworthy for the event to culminate. Okay? So that's the classical distinction between theoric and non-theoric verbs. And there's also pure process verbs like melt. So when the snow is melting, it's not really, there's no speed of an initiator in the sentence. It could be the global warming, it could be the sun, whatever. And there is no result. It's just melting, 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 and we see what happens. Okay? So you should go read her book because it's, of course, much more complicated than what I just said, but there's the predecessor. Okay? The important point is there is no verb, there is no root. Okay? There are just simple denotational functional primitives like state, process, and initiator. Okay? Now, as Anton said, I was working in the framework of nanosyntax, so I want to a bit tell you about what nanosyntax is or special, and then I want to sort of do a little case study on adjectives using this particular framework. Okay? Now the idea, as with all the previous approaches, is that the basic building blocks of language are very small. In fact, they can be smaller than morphemes. Okay, we've already seen that when I told you that in Bantu it looks like we have the category gender and the category number that sort of somehow syntactically freely combined, so it can be human singular, human plural, or inanimate singular, inanimate plural. So they freely combine in a syntactic fashion, but you just have a single morpheme for that combination. Okay? So the number and gender are the basic building blocks of the meaning, but the morpheme pronounces them both at the same time. Okay? So you have the 4 opaque morphemes, each corresponding to a completely regular combination. And the other notion is, of course, a phrasal spell-out, which is a way of producing portmanteau. And so the syntactic trees I would like to sort of see or move towards in my work are simply collections of functional heads. So whatever F1, F2, F3, F4, Fy stands for, it's a functional head of some sort. And there is no lexical head anywhere in the system. And then simply various morphemes are the pronunciations of potentially non-trivial collections of functional heads. Okay? I don't have much more to say except for this is what the lexical entries look like. Okay, now let me try to sort of tell you something about adjectives, and some of you will be yawning because you heard me talk about it already. Now when you look into a random grammar or random description of adjectives, you see that they fall into 2 large classes. Okay? There's gradable adjectives, something like tall, rich, fast, or warm, and there's non-gradable adjectives like nuclear, communal, or baroque. Okay? One way you can test for that is by using a modifier like very or extreme. So there can be an extremely warm weather outside, but it's rather strange to talk about a very nuclear family. Okay? So that's why warm is considered gradable, whereas nuclear non-gradable. Now, of course, there's kind of borderline cases. So, for example, an adjective like American has both of these uses. So, for example, if you say something like a very American movie, that could mean something like, well, it's a movie that has a lot of features which are typical for American movies. Okay? And then you can grade it. Now, the grammar, though, seems to care about it. Okay? So when you want to do the opposite, okay, which you want to say that there is a movie that has very few of such features, you can say, well, even though it was made in Hollywood, it's a very un-American movie. Okay? Would you agree with that, Jeff? That's the way I've seen that described. And there is apparently a difference if you use a non-gradable version of the adjective American. So you can say, for example, this stipend is for American scientists. In this context, it's distinctly odd, in my English judgment, to say this stipend is for very American scientists. Okay? And when you use it in this non-gradable sense, you can't modify it by very, and also the negative form of the adjective uses a different prefix. So whereas in the gradable sense, the American movie, it would negate as an un-American movie, you would say this stipend is for non-American scientists as opposed to un-American scientists.
Just a quibble about
please go ahead.
About the B sentences. It's just and I don't know that I'm not saying this is relevant for you, but un-American tends to have the meaning anti-American or like against our values. You know, that's what un-American means. So if you said this stipend is for un-American scientists, it would mean that they're traitors scientists or something. But in the same for B, if I say un-American movie, I think it thinks it's against our sacred values, but if you said it's a non-American movie, I could take it as grading.
You could take it as?
Grading, right? Even though that movie was made in Hollywood, it's sort of just very non-American, it doesn't have a love interest, and it's, it doesn't have a predictable ending, etc., etc.
Okay, so thank you very much for that. I mean, I was building on descriptions which I failed to cite here, but there's apparently work by Zimmer and Horn on this, which is now cited in a paper by Van den Wijngaard and de Klerk. And they do not have these very sentences, but they say, I mean, I basically tried to, you know, take their description for granted and conjure up some examples. So from what you're saying is that I sort of got things slightly wrong in the sense that un-American really means anti-American.
Something like that,
Yeah. And
I mean, the A sentence is like...
yeah. Okay. Yeah. So in general, yeah.
The star in 27A, yes, definitely.
Yeah. And then what you objected here is actually a sentence which I didn't put here, but I sort of implied that an un-American would not be acceptable here, but it is in this meaning of anti-American, right? But this one works fine in the meaning. Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. So there's a quibble about this one. Okay. This really means anti-American, and Jeff can get the non-American here as a negative version of the.
Well, American with un is a value, which is positive value, but the other one with non is on the location, so it doesn't have to be negative. You can live outside of America, but you shouldn't be against American values.
Great.
So there might be something with the value which you can work with as a separate meaning. So,
where did I end up? Yes, here. Anyway, so the observation that people have made is that gradable adjectives are based on scale, that is, they are associated to properties that kind of can be arranged according to a scale, and gradable adjectives denote certain degree of value on that scale. Whereas if you are a non-gradable adjective, then you either have the property of coming from the US or you don't. And there's no grading in there, okay? When you look at further at the gradable adjectives, then people have observed that there are antonymous pairs of adjectives, and usually people think about them as associated to a particular scale, but denoting the opposite extremes on that scale. So if you have something like a scale of happiness, and if you're at one end of the scale, then you're happy. If you're at the other end, you're sad. You can be friendly or hostile, or you can be healthy and sick. Okay? And people have called these first ones positive gradable adjectives and the other ones negative gradable adjectives. And one of the reasons for that was, whereas you can negate by on the positive ones, that seemed to be impossible for the negative gradable adjectives. Okay? And so here's an idea of how you can sort of model these things using the kind of a functional structure all the way down. So you start with something like a property which is in 31C, and you either have that property or you don't have that property. Okay? You're either a part of the nuclear family or not. Some properties have scales associated to them, and then you denote a particular point on the scale associated to the property. So this would be my kind of semantic syntactic structure for things like happy. And when you're sad, then you denote the opposite part of the scale associated to the property of sort of contentfulness. Okay? And this basically just gives you kind of a semantic decomposition of the three types of roots into functional heads. Okay? Now, why do I want to say that there is this kind of a syntactic structure inside these adjectives? Now, the reason for that is that, the positive and negative adjectives kind of go beyond simple roots. So you can also have affixes which derive positive adjectives. So you can be eventful or fateful. And in all these cases where you have the full derivational morpheme associated to the base, then you can also prefix on. So something can be uneventful, You can be unfaithful, unhelpful, unlawful, or unsuccessful. Okay? So the suffix full simply derives positive gradable adjectives. The suffix less derives negative adjectives. So you can be useless, you can be more or less useless, it's gradable, but you can't be unuseless. You can be breathless, but not unbreathless. So there is a dedicated suffix, a member of the functional vocabulary, which derives exactly the same types of adjectives that the simple root denote. Okay? So the idea is that if I want to give these suffixes a particular contribution to the meaning of the sentence, then I say, well, full attaches to some kind of a base, some kind of a property, and gives you a scale associated to that property. That's why it derives positive gradable adjectives. And notice here I have a suffix that derives or contributes exactly the same meaning that's contained in adjectives like happy. There is no difference between whether you contribute that by an affix or by a morphological. Okay? Similarly, the suffix less derives gradable adjectives that cannot be prefixed by just like your run-of-the-mill negative adjective. And so the affix less basically says, I'm denoting the converse point of a scale that's going to be associated to a particular property, but you need to give me that property. Okay, so that's the rule of this part that you see there. Okay, but the point really is that lexical categories, and I looked briefly at adjectives and verbs, fall into various classes that can be described by various degrees of functional structure. And that sort of seems to indicate that what we have here is functional structure all the way down. Okay? There is no property that a root can express and an affix can't. Okay? So there are no roots in this a-categorial sense in syntax. There is no sense in which an adjective like happy is a-categorial. Okay? It's an adjective that has a scale associated to a property. And so I still think that root makes sense as a morphological term, namely the base to which affix is attached. But I don't think we should try to really get our roots in syntax.
So this eventful, it would be in your tree, that would be the property?
Yes. Now, that's actually a good question. So I was thinking about it because event doesn't look like a property. Okay? And there is, and I really call this thing a property here. But I was very tempted to call it a state. Okay, I think that adjectives, really rather than denoting properties, they denote states. And I think that lots of things changes when you put there a state, because that's, property, that's really a logical notion. It just means, I apply to an individual and I give you a truth value. That's what property means. But I think that state is slightly more appropriate. I mean, it's still kind of funny that the root event would be denoting a state. But I find it much more plausible than denoting a property.
And with adjectives it seems that the negation is at the very periphery, and somewhere there should be grading.
So the negation, negation looks like a morpheme that you can attach to a lot of things. And so I was hoping, looking at the description, that I sort of confused. So I was thinking that you will have two different types of negations. You will have the unnegation that attaches to gradable adjectives, and you will have the non-negation that attaches to non-gradable adjectives. Okay? But just from what Jeff said, that definitely needs to be verified. Okay? And so I was hoping that there would be two different scopes for the negation to have. One would be above the scale, giving you kind of a reversed scale going in the opposite direction. And the kind of simple negation that would simply negate the property, that would be the non-American. Okay? But there's something fishy about it. There's something fishy about it. You're very generous. I tend to have shorter classes. He tells me there's 15 minutes left. We must be gone in 5.
What's happening now? Is that the end of your talk?
Yeah, that's the end of my talk.
Thank you very much. So we have discussion, questions, please, comments.
Joe, please. Sorry.
So I guess with the various verbs like enter and melt and whatever, these features of verbs that people are given like Vendler, they're functional categories kind of decomposition. But yet verbs, if I could call them roots or something, I think there's quite a few functional categories that they never include, like, or say nouns, it's different. Is there any noun that means, some boy, but not any other, that includes whatever that indefinite article is? Or, are there nouns that indicate, just simple nouns that indicate, say, 3 of something? And likewise for verbs, are there verbs that indicate, just the negative of something? There might be, or are there verbs that indicate only the past tense, or I don't know, only some function of just what some verb in the existing language represents, plus one of the functional categories in that language, like a progressive or something like that.
So what you're basically just trying to say is that, when I have all these kind of functional categories all the way to the top, why can't there be a noun that would say, well, I have something like an entity, animate, the human, female.
Well, 3 of them.
Yeah, so a plurality. And more specifically 3. And then
distal demonstrative.
And then I would have something like this corresponding to the Holy Trinity of, I don't know. Yeah. So the question is, why doesn't that happen? And it's a very legitimate question. I would love to know the answer. And I have a suspicion, but I have no calculations. Okay, so the suspicion is that when you store something in the lexicon, okay, it's a bit like, I think about it as building Legos. So you sort of put pieces together, and that at some point you can sort of take a picture of what you have built, and you can give that a name. And so this is a bit like I'm building my syntactic structure, and for example, I build up till here. Okay, I've got something like which is female, human, animate, and it's an entity, so I'm going to call it something, okay, which corresponds to that particular syntactic representation. Now, I'm going to store an association link between the syntactic structure that I have built, and I'm going to give that a name, say, a woman, okay? And then I store this. And there have been studies, of course, that what you store as opposed to what you build out of pieces corresponds to frequency. So when something happens very, very, very frequently, okay, it's easier for you to store it than to store one marker for the smaller bit and a separate marker for the larger bit. Okay, so there's going to be some kind of arithmetics of what is valuable for you to store, what makes sense for you to store. Okay? So to the extent that there are no Holy Trinity nouns, as I would call them, I would have to say, well, that's because they are so infrequent, it makes no sense for us to store them. Rather, we will store the holy thing separately and the Trinity thing separately. And that's what we will see in the language. Okay? Now, for the negative verbs, there's actually some studies where you do find negative verbs. In particular, in Korean, there's a paper by a guy called Im Ki-chang, who said, for example, the verb for not knowing something or not being somewhere is sampliti, whereas other verbs are kind of, compositions. So it's not completely impossible that you memorize it, that you find it noteworthy or happening frequently enough for you to store all these bits and pieces together. But there's always going to be this pressure, and functionalists call that, you have to first of all be efficient. So you want to store as many things together as you want. So that's one kind of pressure, right? So if I store this whole thing, I'm going to be extremely efficient in communicating the Holy Trinity. And if I store them separately, I kind of have less storage. Okay, so that's the other pressure. I don't store things that you don't use very often, build them up. So there's going to be a pressure towards, doing that separately, because then you don't have to memorize, everything as one big chunk. But it's going to be the ultimate lexicon is somehow going to be the output of the two pressures. And so I will just have to hand wave and say it just doesn't happen often enough. That's the only thing I can say. I think that it's very. There is a space in language for frequency, and I use frequency exactly there where it's not an effect. You store suppletive things with high frequency items, and you don't store suppletive things with low frequency.
Well, nothing could be more frequent than a definite article.
Sorry?
So suppose I say, man is indefinite, or maybe definite or indefinite as used in English. And then I say something like ran, okay? Or maybe we better say fan. So what does fan mean? So fan should be the man. So, I met a man yesterday. Fan really irritated me. Okay.
Yeah. So
why not? Why can't you have a noun that's frequent?
So my point here has to be, okay, it should be possible. Okay. In fact, it should be much more possible than. So it should be much more like I should be able to see a special form for the man as opposed to the. Give you something low frequency, okay? The blueberry.
Of course, I didn't mean it to be the because it means the, but it's just as well be zoop,
Yeah. So there is a scale of likelihood where this is more likely to get lexicalized together and this less likely. Right now, I don't know for a fact that these things are not attested. And in fact, if you look at proper names, there is the possibility that proper names are actually behaving that way. Now, in Bulgarian, for example, anybody speaking Bulgarian? There is a difference in kinship terms. So if you say my mother, okay, I know you have to say my coming. Okay, even though in Bulgarian, if you would say something like my house would be kshta ta me. Okay, so there is a definite article here with house, which is missing with mother. Okay, and there is a set of nouns you have to memorize, and they're kinship terms, but I don't think they're all kinship terms. So I think that, don't try, but I think that grandfather already has the definite article. So I think you say gadotomi. with the definite article. But I'm nowhere close to sure about this. But there is a subset of kinship terms which like the definite article. So that could be a point in favor. So I'm not so sure that I want to prohibit this.
My lexicalist colleagues would be nervous from your derivation of sad and happy as one word, which was happy, 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 and then became sad. Does it mean that you would, let's say, derive day from night, or white from black? You know, they deal with it as semantic opposition, and they don't take it for grammatical negation. So can you see some difference between...
Yes, so the reason for claiming that it's a grammatical negation is because they don't combine with un.
So those which are not...
So there is some kind of an intuition that you can't say unsaid for the reason that's like saying unhappy, and you have two identical negative markers, one on top of the other, and we don't do that. Right, so the reason why you would want to have a syntactic decomposition there, an actual negation, would be to block this un. Now there's sort of another reason why, so there is a work by Parrott who is sort of playing around with things like many versus few. Okay? And her idea is that few should actually be syntactically decomposed into not many, and here the reasons are even stronger because you can get split scope in some languages. That is, if you say in some languages, I don't know, there have to be few errors in the assignment, then you can get a difference. You can have a negation scoping over the modal and the many part of the quantifier below. Okay, so here there's even stronger reasons, but for the unhappy, it's the type of negation that doesn't like to take any kind of scope beyond where you find it.
And I'm very sorry, but I have still one question because I won't come next time. I know that there was, with the root thing, the theoretical question is what is your stand about elements in derivation? Yeah? How does derivation start? What's the beginning point? What that projects? So there must be a moment when you insert to the sentence Eliška or Maša. So you have feminine, you have being, you have singular, you build a tree, at which moment it becomes woman or Eve or girl, or at some moment the word has to get in.
So Michal's idea is that you basically spell out anytime you put two things together, like, you know, an entity that's animate, you have to spell out.
So minimally at the face, at the spell out
at
face.
Every step of merge.
Yeah, that's quite different. I mean, that's early lexical insertion. That's deep structure insertion. That is, as soon as you have a category, you put a word with it.
Well, I mean, I don't want to go into this deep structure, surface structure, because to the extent that I understood the deep. I mean, does deep structure precede merge or follow merge? So I mean, I don't know.
Well, I
you
mean,
can definitely
as soon as you have a category in the tree, then you put a word there. I guess you can't get any deeper than that.
Yeah, but the thing is that you can then override. So when you, for example, have these things like...
so happy becomes sad.
Yes, exactly. Yes. Happy becomes sad. Exactly. You know, because, I mean, that's exactly like with the merge. Okay, so we have a scale, there is a property, and you decide, okay, I'm going to pronounce it as happy. Okay? And then you put here your negation, and there's a slight complication here because the lexical entry for sad actually looks like a negation of actually happy. It's not a negation of just about any type of adjective, it's a negation of happy. So you put your negation, and assuming that here you pronounce happy and you negate the happy, then you pronounce this one as sad, and you forget everything else that you did before. That's the way the machinery works.
Yes, thanks very much. I have the same question that I sort of asked you when we were talking about.
Sorry, we don't have any time, so very, very short, very short.
Really short. I still don't see where the idiosyncratic content is. And I have my own examples which I'll use in my talk, but just taking Lita's example, like the difference between names. How can that be semantically decomposed into functional?
No, so you know, here there's gonna be thousands lexical items that have exactly this structure, and they're gonna be all gradable adjectives. Okay? And they're gonna be at a tie for insertion, so they all will match exactly the structure. Okay, and so you choose one particular one, like happy, that you wanna talk about, and that mushy content, you know, that sort of, you know, smiley faces and so on, that's part of the conceptual system.
Okay, so there's no more time for all. Thank you very much.